Well, welcome back. In this session, we're going to begin to actually look at the text of the letter to the Galatians. And I'm going to, for the most part, be focusing on the main idea of each section and trying to follow Paul's logic through the letter. There are a few things that I want to look at in a little more depth, and hopefully, time permitting, we will get to that. So beginning in chapter 1, we see the first 5 verses there are really a pretty conventional greeting for Paul. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. Other than that, he actually says quite a bit about the gospel in these first 5 verses, which is a pretty interesting way to say hello. So you may want to look at that as you're charting it and ask yourself, why would Paul give such pointed theological content in his greeting? But I think when we get to verse 6, this becomes clear. And I put it on the board here just to make it a little easier to follow along. I'm astonished that you're so quickly deserting him who called you to the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Now, this is very important. Paul actually considers what is being taught there a different gospel. He said not that there is another gospel, but there are some who trouble you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. And I want you to look at how emphatic he is in this next verse. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one we preach to you, let him be accursed. Now, that is strong language. He said if an angel from heaven comes down with a different message than what you've been given in the gospel, let him be accursed. So this is a very serious thing. And this is his introduction to the letter, really. He had just gotten done saying hello, and he launches into this thing saying, if anybody says anything different, let him be accursed. Why are you running off to another gospel? Things of this nature. And he repeats himself. I mean, this wasn't just him getting swept up in the moment. He actually says, now listen, I'm going to say it again. Let him be accursed. I'm not playing around here. He wants to be very clear with these guys. He said, now am I trying to get the approval of man or God? No. Am I trying to please man? No. If we were still trying to please man, I would not be a servant of Christ. In other words, you can't live your life to serve man and serve Christ. You're going to have to pick one. And Paul says, I'm not serving man here. I am serving Christ. And these rhetorical questions, in other words, questions with an obvious answer, they really show Paul's heart here. He said, no, I'm not doing this just to please myself or to please some other group of people. I don't care what people think. I'm doing this for what God thinks. Now, this next verse, I think, then really helps us understand the whole first part of this letter. So let's look at this more closely. For I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel. Oops. There should have been some highlighting on there. But anyway, let's look at some key words here. The gospel is not man's gospel. Yes, it was preached by me, but it's not man's gospel. So what we see in this whole first section of the book, beginning just after this, is Paul goes through his history. He goes through what happened to him after he was converted. Where does he go? Where does he get this gospel from? Who confirmed this gospel? Why is he out preaching it? He goes through his whole history now. And it's all based on this idea right here, that this is not man's gospel. In other words, people are not free to just do whatever they want with this. This is not something that came from man, and man can't mess with it. And this is what he begins to show then as we move through the text. So let's look at a few of these things. In verse 12, he said it's not from man. He got the gospel through a revelation of Jesus Christ. And if you read about Paul's conversion in Acts, you will see that he's being quite literal here. Jesus actually revealed himself to him and said, Paul, what are you doing? And so he said, I didn't get this gospel by hearsay. I didn't read about it in a book. Jesus showed up, knocked me off my horse, and told me this. Like, this is where I got the gospel from. And then he said, verse 17, not only that, I didn't then run off and go become someone's disciple. He said, I went off to Arabia. You see? And then when I finally did go to Jerusalem, I met Peter and James, and they were good with what I was saying. And furthermore, as you get farther into it, the elders and whatnot in Jerusalem there, he said, they gave me the right hand of fellowship. In other words, they were in complete agreement and they were backing my ministry, and they commissioned Paul to go and preach to the Gentiles. So, who are the Galatians? Well, they are a Gentile church. Where did Paul get the authority to preach this gospel to them? Well, first and foremost, from Jesus. But it was confirmed by Peter, James, and some of the rest of the elders and apostles in Jerusalem, and he was actually commissioned to go out and preach to the Gentiles. And so, what we have here is Paul saying, look, I don't know who's been lying to you about the gospel, but I got this right from Jesus. And it was confirmed by the people in Jerusalem. So if these guys are saying they're from Jerusalem or from I was confirmed. I was given the right hand of fellowship from the guys in Jerusalem. So you see how this pivots on this idea that this is not man's gospel. So he's beginning to correct the Galatians at this point by reviewing for them what this gospel is that they heard. That this isn't just some idea that he had or that some little group of people had. This is from God. This he got from Jesus himself. So that's the origin of Paul's gospel and why he was preaching to them in Galatia in the first place. But now let's look at this, the authority of the gospel. In chapter 2 and verse 3, he's telling this story about how he went with Titus to Jerusalem and met some of the guys there. And he said, not even those influential leaders in Jerusalem forced Titus to be circumcised. He said, I was in Jerusalem. In other words, I brought a Greek guy with me, and even the elders that were there said, no, he doesn't have to be circumcised. So, in other words, Paul's trying to say, I'm not just making this stuff up. And it's not like it's me against the people in Jerusalem, or it's me against the Jews. No, the influential Jewish leaders of the church in Jerusalem said, no, you don't have to circumcise him. And so you get to 2:11 now, and he's telling this story about Peter, and how Peter, out of fear or whatever, began to compromise the gospel and refuse to eat with Gentiles when certain people from James of the circumcision party, as we talked about earlier, these people that said, Jesus wasn't enough, you got to add the law to it, you got to add circumcision to it. He said, there was a time when Peter even got sucked into this. And he said, and I corrected him publicly. Well, what's he saying? Not even Peter has the right to alter this gospel. This gospel cannot be changed by anyone. Not Peter, not the apostles. No one has the authority to change this gospel. The gospel is the authority. It comes from God. And finally, or again, we see that not even the Jews are justified by the law. So in 2:15, he begins to explain that the Jews are saved by faith. They're not saved by their perfect law keeping, because if they could be saved by their perfect law keeping, then Christ died for nothing. Now, as you're studying this, I want you to think about this. If the works of the law could bring about righteousness, then, according to Paul, Christ died for nothing. In other words, if we could do this simply by following the rules from a book, why would Jesus have to become a man? Why would he have to die? Why would he have to go through all of this? None of that would be necessary if what these false teachers were saying was actually true. If you really could become righteous through your own efforts and through keeping the law, then there was no reason for Jesus to die, and the gospel is meaningless. This is why this was such a big deal to Paul. To him, this was the difference between there is a gospel and there isn't a gospel. That's how serious this was. It wasn't just a matter of cultural differences. And, this was a matter of, no, if you begin to try to earn your righteousness through keeping the law, you have just done away with the cross. You have done away with Jesus. You have done away with the gospel. And you can go on from there. If that's gone, then our hope is gone, our future is gone, our righteousness is gone. All we're left with is a law that we can't possibly keep, and sins that are left unforgiven. So this was crucial. This was very, very important. And the next thing that we're going to see, Paul began to argue with them, and you see in the logic here of what he's saying. He says, so how did you get the Spirit? And he said, through the working of the law or from the hearing of faith? Well, it was faith. So you got 3-2, right? How did you receive the Spirit? So he's bringing them back and making them remember their own experience and said, how did this happen? Did you keep the law so well that God said, here's the Spirit, thank you very much, you're doing such a great job? How are miracles done? Are miracles done through, well, you sure did make a good kosher meal there? Or by the hearing of faith? He said, no, miracles are done through the hearing of faith. And then finally, how are you sons of Abraham? Well, he goes on in 3:7 to say that the sons of Abraham are all those that are of the faith of Abraham. And this opens this up to everyone. So in this opening section here now, you'll see that Paul argues from his own history and from the experience of the Galatians themselves that righteousness, miracles, and the Spirit of God, the gospel itself, did not come about through the works of the law. It came about by the action of God and the hearing of faith.